Okay, so let's hit H on the keyboard, and we'll select our direct light, our target for the direct light, and the skylight. Okay, and we'll just delete those temporarily. Alright, so we're back with the scene with no lighting. And let's switch our renderer from the scanline to Mentalray. So we'll go into the render tab here, scroll all the way down to the bottom to assign renderer, and we'll just pick Mentalray. Okay, so just double click that. Right, and to get a GI render in Mentalray, it's actually pretty easy. You don't really need to do a lot of tweaks to the settings to get a decent one. Alright, so let's just hit F9 to render, and we'll see what it looks like with no lights in the scene. Okay, so let's maybe clone that one and minimize it. Okay, and let's go back into the render settings with F10. Okay, so if we go down here in the indirect illumination tab and check on global illumination, let's check enable there, and let's do a render. And it'll tell us that there's no photon emitter in the scene. Alright, so we need to add a light in here to generate some photons for the global illumination. Alright, so we'll hit OK to that, and it'll still render, but it's not going to look any different even with the GI on. Okay, so let's just close that render. Right, and let's go back into the lighting tab. Okay, and we'll use another skylight, so let's grab one of those, and we'll just put that in the top view here somewhere. Okay, and then we'll hit F9 again. Okay, and you can see that this is going to come out completely black. It's not showing anything in the scene. Okay, and that's because we need to use Final Gather for our GI here. Alright, so we'll go up to the top, and let's enable Final Gather here by checking this box. Okay, and let's hit render now. And I'll just pause the video while this renders. Okay, so there it is, and you can see that already looks pretty good. That's close to what we had with the light tracer and the scanline renderer. Alright, and we don't really have much noise, and everything looks like it's shaded pretty smooth here. Okay, and the objects here really don't have any sharp corners or any real recesses. Alright, if we had something else in here that had some sharp edges on it, we'd probably have some blotching in the shadows. Okay, and just to demonstrate that a little bit more, I'm actually going to model in another piece here just quickly. Alright, so I'm going to clone the render and minimize it. We'll just close these, and let's maybe go into the top view. Alright, we'll zoom in a little bit here. And let's just maybe go into the create panel, and let's grab a box. Okay, let's draw that out, maybe something like that. And we'll give it a little bit of height. Okay, and let's see, let's rotate it. Alright, and let's make it a little bit smaller. So it's going to take the length up a little bit to make it a little bit longer, and I'm going to shorten it up a little bit on the width. And we'll take the height down a bit. Okay, and let's move it in a little bit closer to the objects here. And we'll rotate it slightly. And you don't have to do this if you don't want to. I'm just going to do this for a demonstration purpose here, for some hard edges. Alright, so I'm just going to put that like that. And let's maybe add some segments to this. Let's do maybe something like, let's just take it up to 30 here, and I'm going to give it a little bit more height. Alright, let's bring that up a bit. Okay, and I just want to extrude some of these out so we have kind of a venting detail here. Alright, so I'm going to go and convert this to editable poly. Alright, and let's go into polygon and check on ignore backfacing. I'm just going to select every second polygon here along the top. Okay, and we'll just extrude these out. Alright, so I'm going to bring that out a little bit. Let's do like maybe 0.5 or so. And okay, and then I'm going to go into edge, grab the corner edge here, do a ring, and a connect. And let's do 2 segments. And okay, and then we'll go back into polygon and turn off ignore backfacing. And in the front view, let's zoom in here, and I'm just going to grab all the polys in the middle. Okay, just along the middle strip there that we just put in there. And let's just extrude that in a little bit more. Alright, so let's do an extrude, do local normal, and we'll take it to a negative amount. Alright, just to pull the sides in a bit. Let's do negative 0.5. hit OK. And it will get out a polygon. Let's change the color to black. And I'm just going to throw the white shader on there. Alright, so we'll apply that. And I'm not going to worry about chamfering down the edges or anything. Let's just move this over slightly. I'm just going to zoom the camera out a little bit. Okay. Okay, so let's do another render here with F9. Okay, so there we go, and you can see that it doesn't really look that good on this box piece here. It looks a little blotchy along the inside here, and a little bit just whacked out overall. It's not very clean on the shading. Okay, that's because we don't have enough samples in the scene to actually pick up all of this edge detail here. Okay, so let's clone this, and we'll minimize it. And let's go back into the render settings with F10. Right, and there's a lot of settings in here for the Mentalray renderer, and we're not going to worry about most of them. We really don't need to go over all this stuff down here. The only thing we really need to concentrate on for a basic GI or clean render is pretty much the final gather settings here. Okay. So we'll just go over a few of the settings here that apply to what we're doing here. Alright, so we have a multiplier here for the final gather, and this is similar to what's in the light tracer settings. It's kind of an override for the indirect light in the scene, or the GI. Alright, so let's take this up to 3, and we'll do another render. Okay, so you can see that's wicked bright now, and let's just close this one maybe. And you really don't need to really pump this up too often. 1 is usually more than enough. It's pretty sensitive, so you probably might not need to really go higher than 1 unless there's a particular reason to do so. Okay, so I usually leave that at 1. Let's go over here, and you can see we have a color swatch here. And this is an overall tint for the indirect illumination in the scene. Alright, so let's maybe make a blue color here. We'll do another render. Okay, there we go, and you can see that's pretty intense on the blue. We also don't have any additional lighting in the scene. If you did, this would probably be a lot more dumbed down than it is here. Some of the other lights would wash out the blue color a little bit, so it wouldn't be so pronounced as it is right now. Alright, so that's a general tint, and it's pretty touchy as well, so be careful with it. Let's close that. Okay, and here we have rays per final gather point. Okay, and this is how many rays it'll use to calculate the GI in a scene. Alright, and the default's 250. Obviously, higher is better, and it's more accurate the higher you go up, using more rays. But it'll also take longer and longer to render as you pump this number up. Okay, so just be careful with that. There's no reason to go super high if you don't need to, so always work your way up from the default 250 until you get it smoothed out. Right? And more rays will definitely help smooth out noise problems, as well as give you far accurate shadows. Okay. An initial final gather point density here is kind of like a multiplier for the rays, how many it's going to use to calculate the GI. Right, so let's maybe take this up a bit. Let's do 500 on the rays. Okay, and we'll do another render. Okay, so there we go, and let's compare this one to the original here. Alright, you see they're very similar. This one's a little bit brighter, just slightly brighter, even though lighting's the exact same. I don't know if you'll be able to tell with the compression on the video, but this one's a lot smoother. You have a little bit more contrast in the shadows here underneath this punch-in, as well as the top vents here. Alright, so let's make a clone of this one, and we'll minimize it. Let's close that and minimize this one. Okay, we'll take up the point density a little bit higher here. Let's do maybe 3. Alright, so we'll have 3 times as many rays for the calculation. Let's do another render. Okay, let's compare this one to the previous one. Alright, and you can see this one's really smooth. We really have no noise in here whatsoever. You also notice that the shadowing on this piece here has a lot more contrast along the edges here. This one's a little bit washed out, and this one's a lot more defined. Okay, and that's because the number of samples is a lot higher, and it can calculate the contrast between the shadow and the edges a lot better and more accurately. Okay, so let's do a clone of this one and minimize it. And just for the sake of the tutorial here, I'm going to actually pump this up quite high to see if we can get that showing up really good here. So I'm going to take up the samples from 500 to maybe 1,000. Okay, and we'll do another render. Alright, so that one took quite a bit longer to render because I had to calculate so many more rays for the final gather. Alright, so let's compare this to the previous one. And overall they look pretty close. You might not notice the difference unless you look really closely. You can see that this one has a little bit of blotching along the tops of these ridges here, as well as along the side and front. And hopefully you can see this with the compression. This one over here is a lot more accurate. Most of the blotching is gone, and we have a nice even shadow along these edges here and underneath the front. Okay, so if you have a lot of detail in your scene that's got sharp edges or recesses or whatever, and you need to get rid of that for the render, just play with these two settings here. Okay, you can also go into the rendering tab here and play with the minimum and maximum samples per pixel. You can actually take this up to say 64 or even in some cases 256, and that'll also smooth things out a little bit, but it'll take a lot longer to render if you jack these settings through the roof. Okay, so just be careful with those ones. And let's go back in here for a second, and I should mention that there's also some preset settings that come with Mentalray here. Right, and if you go to these, they're pretty much tweaked out versions of the settings here. You can see this is way up to 10,000, and we also have the multiplier at 4. And that's going to take a long time to render. I'm not going to render right now because it's probably going to take over an hour with this many rays in the scene, even for a simple scene like this. So I recommend not going quite that high if you don't need to. You can just start out with maybe either the default settings or even a medium setting and just work your way up a little bit until you get your render looking smooth and with not a lot of noise in it. Okay, so let's maybe just change the background color here just to make it a little bit different. So I'm going to open up the material editor. Alright, we'll grab another slot here, and let's just change the diffuse color on this one to maybe a blue shade. And you'll notice on my renders on CG Tuts, a lot of them have a blue background for the ground plane there. Okay, let's actually select the plane and apply that. And that's just to get some depth behind the model and also separate the objects from the background. Right, so let's go back into the render settings here, and we'll just take this back to what we had. We had a multiplier of 3, and we had 500 samples here. Okay, and we'll just render this out again. Let's do that, and I'll just pause while this goes. Okay, so let's compare this one to the previous one, and you can see that it adds a lot more pop to the scene if you have a different background color rather than just the monochrome background here. Alright, and depending on what you want it to look like or what you're using it for, you'll have to pretty much make the call on that yourself. Okay, so let's maybe add another light into the scene. Let's close this. Okay, Max was nice enough to crash on me there, so I lost those renders we had minimized down the bottom here. Alright, I still have the one we just did, but I lost the other ones, but that's okay. I had the scene saved, so we're still in the same place. Alright, so let's add additional light in here, and let's go into the lighting tab, and we could do another target direct if you wanted to have directional shadows here, but let's maybe try something a little bit different. Let's grab a Mentalray Omni, okay, and let's go into the top view, and we'll just put this over here to the left of the camera maybe. Okay, so let's click that in there. Right, and we'll move it around a little bit. Let's maybe bring it up a little bit in the front view. Just gonna switch that back. Okay, let's bring that up a little bit. And we'll just move it around slightly here. Maybe something like that. And we just want to get a little bit of additional light on the sides of the objects here, kind of like a rim light, but it won't be as intense as a rim light would be. Alright, this will just help us give it a little bit of color variation. Okay, so we'll put it about there. And let's also go into the modify panel here. We're going to uncheck shadows here. We're not going to cast any shadows on this. And let's also go into the color here, and we'll change this to maybe a light orange. Alright, so let's take this up a bit. Let's do maybe a medium peach color here, sort of. Okay, close that, and let's also take the multiplier down a bit. Let's do maybe 0.4 or so. We'll try that. Okay, and I also want to exclude the background plane here from this light. Alright, so we just have the orange color on the actual objects. Alright, so let's go into the exclude box here, and we'll select our plane. Let's hit this arrow here to put it into the exclude list, and you can do that by illumination, shadow casting, or both. And we'll just leave it on both here, so hit OK, and that light won't affect our background plane now at all. Okay, and let's also go back into the render settings. Right, and just for the sake of the test renders here, I'm going to take this down a little bit just so it'll be a little bit quicker. Let's take this back down to 1, and we'll take the raise down to 250 for now. Okay, and let's also check on two-sided for the material, so we'll fill this gap in the teapot here. Okay, so let's open up the material editor, and we'll select our gray shader here, and let's just check two-sided, so it'll render the inside and outside of this teapot. Okay, and we'll do another test render here with F9. Okay, so there we go, and you can see that brightened up the scene quite a bit here. Let's compare it to the original here. Okay, so that warmed the whole scene up a bit. We got a lot more light in underneath here in this section, and it also add quite a bit of color variance to the overall shading of the objects here. And let's maybe do another one here. Let's just clone this render, minimize that one, let's close that one, and minimize this one. Okay, and let's take the multiplier down slightly on this one. I think it's a little too bright. Let's do maybe 0.35. Okay, and we'll go back into the top view. And I'm just going to hold down shift on the move tool and just clone this light over to the other side. Okay, we'll choose copy. Okay. And let's make the color on this one maybe a blue shade. Okay, so we'll do maybe a medium blue here, something like that. And okay, we'll move this one up a little bit higher, right, just so we get a little bit more light on the tops. Okay, and we'll also just move it around slightly here and find a good angle for it. Let's do something like that maybe. And let's take the multiplier on this one down to just 3. Okay, and we won't cast shadows on this one as well. And let's also exclude it from the plane, which it already is, because we copied it. So let's hit OK. Right, and let's do another test render here with F9. Okay, so let's compare this one to the previous one. And that's the original. Let's minimize that. Let's open this one. Okay, so you can see that's a little bit lighter. And overall we have more of a color variation between the left and right sides of the model here. We have more of a hot spot on the right side, and then it fades into kind of this orange shading here. Right, and that's one way to get some color variation in the shading. Another way would be to use an HDRI image, but we'll get into that when we get into the Vray section. I'm not going to go over that for Mentalray. Okay, so you also notice that took a little bit longer to render, and that's because each additional light will generate photons that'll have to be calculated by Mentalray and final gather. All right, so the more lights you use, the longer it'll take to render for sure. So just keep that in mind. All right, let's minimize this one, and we'll clone the new one here and minimize it. Okay, and you can see it's quite a bit brighter than the previous ones. We might even need to take the GI down a little bit on the multiplier so it's not so bright. Okay, so we'll minimize this. Let's go back into the render settings with F10. Okay, and we'll take the multiplier down here for the final gather to something a little bit lower. Let's do maybe 0.75. Okay, and we'll see what this looks like. So let's do another render. Alright, there we go. And we'll compare this one to the previous one, and you can see that's quite a bit darker here. You also notice that the orange light and blue light is a little bit more pronounced in the darker one than the first one here. And that's just because the overall white light from the global illumination isn't as intense. Alright, so it's not washing it out so much. Okay, so I think this one might be a little bit too dark. We could probably take the multiplier up a little bit more. Alright, so let's maybe do a final render here before we move on to Vray. So I'm just going to minimize that, and we'll clone this one and minimize it. Okay. Okay, and let's go back into the render settings here. Alright, let's take the multiplier up on this to maybe 0.9. We'll take our point density up to say 2, and we'll take our raise here up a little bit more. Let's do maybe 500 or so. Okay, and let's also go back into the renderer here, and we have a filter type here. It's set to box by default, and you can change it to other ones here, and it'll maybe improve the results a little bit. The Mitchell one is pretty good, as well as the Laconzos one. It'll take a little bit longer to render, but you'll probably get a better result rather than using box. Alright, so switch it to Mitchell. Okay, and let's maybe do another render here. Okay, so there we go, and we'll compare that to the last one. Alright, so you can see we're getting a pretty good result here. Everything's pretty smooth. We have a nice transition on the shadows. We don't have any noise really at all in here that I can see. And you'll notice that on the side of the box piece here, we don't have a shadow in this inset here anymore. Alright, and that's just because we put that blue light over on the right side here, and it's just filling that void with light, so you're not going to get a shadow on that edge. Alright, and that's something to watch out for when you're doing a GI render. If you add too much light, you're going to lose some of the shadows. Okay, so you can add the additional lights if you want to get some color variation in there, or you can just go with a straight GI, or maybe GI and one target direct if you want to have some directional shadows. Okay, so lots of times I'll just render with the basic GI and maybe add in one direct light rather than adding in multiple lights all around the scene here. Okay, and that'll just really depend on what your model looks like and how you want the final result to come out. Alright, so I just thought I'd show that before we move on to Vray. So let's maybe just close these other ones here. Alright, and you can see you can get a pretty good result without having to go super crazy on the number of rays in the scene here. Right, and if you want to, you can just experiment with some of these presets here, as well as just typing in some settings and seeing what you come up with. If you want a really super crisp render that's really accurate in the shadow areas, you can set this to very high. Okay, and that'll take a super long time to render, but you'll get a pretty much perfect result. Alright, so you probably don't need to go that high. That's really up there. You could probably do a tenth of that or so, and you'll probably still get a good result. Alright, so I think that'll be about the final thing we'll do for Mentalray here, and we'll move into Vray now.